On my 72nd birthday, I was expecting flowers, or at least a card. Instead, my son handed me a beautifully bound folder, a contract for new housing, he called it, a nursing home. He said I no longer fit into their lifestyle. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply signed my response through a notary. 3 days later, he received a letter. You have chosen to abandon your mother. She now abandons everything, including the business registered in her name. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Richardson. I was 72 years old the day I received the message. Not a call, not a card, just a short text on a Tuesday afternoon. Come by Saturday. We'll celebrate your birthday here. That was it. No emoji, no warmth, no question about what I might want. The sender was my son, Andrew, and it took him less than 10 words to summarize what once would have been a week of planning. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after reading it, the phone resting silently in my hand. The late afternoon light fell in golden streaks across the tiles, and the tea in my cup had gone lukewarm. Outside the window, a neighbor's dog barked once, then fell silent again. I could hear the refrigerator humming. Everything around me felt distant and slightly hollow, as if the air had shifted and I was the last to notice. I lived alone in a small, well-kept house in northern New Jersey. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I had planted every flower in the garden, fixed every squeaky hinge, chosen each photo on the walls. My husband, Thomas, had passed 12 years earlier, and since then, I had built a quiet rhythm that kept me company better than most people ever had. I was a retired accountant, once meticulous with numbers, now careful with time. I had given up spreadsheets for baking, client meetings for audiobooks, the commuter train for long morning walks. Andrew was my only child. I had raised him with care, even precision, not the smothering kind, just a steady, invisible scaffolding beneath him that I hoped would make life easier. I paid for college, helped with his first business loan, watched his dog when he traveled, supported him when his wife Christina wanted to quit her job and reimagine herself. I never asked for anything in return. I thought that was what good mothers did, give endlessly without keeping score. Still, birthdays had always mattered to me, not for the attention, but for the acknowledgement. A moment in the year to pause and say, "You're still here. You still matter." When I was younger, Thomas would write long, handwritten cards that made me cry. Andrew used to pick out little things that meant something. A copy of my favorite novel, a new pair of gardening gloves, once even a set of antique measuring spoons I had admired in a shop window. But this year, all I got was a text. I looked at the clock. 3 days until Saturday. I told myself it was just a busy week. Maybe the message was rushed. Maybe they were planning a surprise. Maybe I was being oversensitive. But I knew better. I'd seen the shift coming for years, creeping in like dust, collecting on a shelf you stop noticing. Fewer visits, less eye contact. The way Christina winced when I offered to help in the kitchen. The way Andrew scrolled his phone during my stories. They weren't cruel, just done. Like people quietly folding the chairs after a show that's gone on too long. Still, I responded to the message. "Thank you, I'll be there." I added a smiley face at the end. I don't know why. Habit, maybe, or hope. The next day, I pulled out the green silk dress I'd kept in the back of the closet, the one Thomas had always loved on me. I hadn't worn it in years, but it still fit, though it hung looser than I remembered. I polished my shoes, chose a pair of earrings that didn't dangle too much. I even wrapped a small gift for my grandson, an Afghan I had crocheted over the past month, deep navy and cream, stitched quietly while the world moved on around me. I didn't expect a party. Not really. But I hoped, foolishly perhaps, for something small. A cake, a few candles, a toast, the sound of my name spoken with affection. Instead, what I got was an invitation delivered with the same energy people use to confirm dentist appointments. It was clear now, this wasn't about me. It was about obligation, a checkbox. I spent the rest of the week tending to my garden, pruning the hydrangeas, watering the herbs. It kept my hands busy and my mind just far enough away. But every time I passed the kitchen table, my eyes fell on the small envelope I had placed there, just in case. A card I had bought for myself weeks earlier, silly as it sounds. I hadn't meant to use it. I just liked the picture on the front. A painted bird perched on a branch, looking outward, free and unconcerned. Saturday came, and with it a light drizzle that coated the sidewalks and made the air smell like soil and memory. I dressed carefully, wrapped the gift, and stood in front of the mirror for a few extra moments. The woman staring back at me had soft lines around her eyes, a silver streak at her part, and hands that had held more than most people would ever know. She was ready, or at least she had convinced herself she was. I called a cab and stepped out onto the porch, umbrella in hand. As the car pulled away from my street, I looked back once. The flowers swayed gently in the wind, and the porch light, though unnecessary in daylight, had flickered on automatically. It was my birthday. I told myself that was enough. I didn't yet know that the real gift waiting for me wasn't wrapped in ribbon. It would come days later in a sealed envelope with legal weight and irreversible clarity. But that evening, as I rode toward what should have been a celebration, I had no idea how much would be lost, or how much in the end I would find. The cab dropped me off in front of their townhouse just before 5. The rain had slowed to a mist, clinging to the edges of my coat and forming delicate droplets on the gift bag in my lap. I stepped onto the pavement slowly, bracing myself not against the weather, but against what I couldn't name, something like resistance or resignation, though I wasn't sure which. Their house stood in a row of nearly identical buildings, well-kept, modern, and expressionless, the kind of place designed to impress from a distance but offer little warmth up close. I rang the bell and waited. I could already hear music inside, low, ambient, curated. Voices rose and fell, laughter spilling intermittently into the evening air. When the door opened, it wasn't Andrew but one of their friends, a woman I didn't recognize. She smiled, said my name, and stepped aside as if she were holding the door for a delivery. No hug, no welcome, just motion. I entered the foyer, already crowded with coats and umbrellas, and was met with the scent of catered food and expensive candles. Everything looked polished. Tables lined with appetizers, drinks flowing in tall glasses, people dressed as if this were a networking event instead of a birthday dinner. I stood for a moment, uncertain of where to go, before someone gently nudged past me with a tray of shrimp cocktails. Eventually, I spotted Andrew across the room. He was talking to someone, gesturing with the same wide sweep of his hands I had seen 1,000 times since he was a boy. Confident, animated, slightly performative, I watched him laugh at something and then glance in my direction. There was a flicker of acknowledgement. Then he returned to the conversation without calling me over. It wasn't until 10 minutes later that he made his way to me. He gave me a quick embrace, brief and distracted, like someone fulfilling a chore before moving on to more pressing matters. He told me to make myself comfortable and pointed me toward a seat in the corner of the living room beside a side table crowded with empty glasses and napkins, the kind of chair people only used when the others were full. I sat down and placed the gift bag on the floor by my feet. I folded my hands in my lap and smiled at the people around me, none of whom made any move to engage. They were busy, talking about investments, schools, travel plans. Their world spun on a different axis, and I was a decorative piece on the edge of the frame. Christina passed by once, nodded, and offered a vague compliment about my dress. I thanked her, but she was already gone. She floated from guest to guest like a hostess in a lifestyle magazine, efficient and polished. I noticed how often she touched Andrew's arm, how she whispered things in his ear with the familiarity of shared secrets. There was no hostility in her, but no warmth either. I had long since stopped hoping for anything more. Dinner was served buffet style. I filled a small plate with salad and chicken and returned to my corner. No one saved me a seat at the table. That was fine. I had always preferred to observe, but it stung more than I admitted to see my son laughing across the room while I ate alone. Then came the moment that was meant to be for me. Christina clinked her glass and called for everyone's attention. The room quieted, and Andrew stepped forward, holding a sleek, navy blue folder in his hands. I sat up a little straighter, unsure of what was coming. He began speaking about age, about transitions, about how, as families grow and evolve, roles change. He mentioned the importance of planning ahead, of comfort, of making sure loved ones are safe and supported. The words floated past me like mist, beautifully packaged, empty at the core. And then he said it, that they had found a wonderful place for me, a beautiful community with medical care, social events, even an art studio. A fresh chapter, he called it. Freedom. He handed me the folder. Inside was a contract, neatly printed, already signed by the facility administrator, move-in date highlighted in yellow, a brochure tucked inside with smiling gray-haired people gathered around puzzles and swimming pools. I looked at it, then at him. He smiled. The room clapped. Someone joked that I was moving up in the world. I nodded, my lips still curved in a polite expression that I didn't feel. I closed the folder gently and rested it on my knees. The silence I held in that moment was louder than anything I could have said, but no one noticed. They had already moved on, to dessert, to drinks, to the next conversation. I stayed in that chair until it was late, until guests began to leave and the noise began to fade. No one asked how I felt. No one asked if I was excited. My opinion was not part of the celebration. The decision had been made. My future had been planned for me. All that was left was my agreement, silent and expected. On the ride home, I didn't cry. I stared out the window at the city lights, wondering how many mothers had felt what I felt. The slow erasure, the quiet betrayal wrapped in careful language, the way your name gets softer in their mouths, less familiar, more distant. I thought of the house I had built with Thomas, of the bank forms I had signed, of the small, powerful details I had never spoken aloud. They thought I was just an old woman in a green dress, but I remembered everything. The morning after the party, I awoke earlier than usual. The light hadn't yet crept fully into the room, and the house was still wrapped in that hushed silence that always reminded me of childhood snow days. But there was no softness in me now, just clarity. The kind that settles after something final has been said, even if no one realized it was final at the time. I didn't make tea. I didn't toast bread. I walked barefoot down the hallway, past the photos of Andrew as a toddler, past the framed certificates from my years in accounting, past the coat hooks that had held Thomas's old jackets until I finally gave them away. I opened the hall closet and pulled down the key from the top shelf. It was a small key, brass and unremarkable, but I had never lost track of it. In the back of my bedroom closet, beneath a carefully folded stack of blankets, sat the fireproof box. I carried it to the kitchen table and placed it gently down. My hands moved steadily, with purpose. I hadn't opened it in years, not because I'd forgotten it, but because there had never been a reason. Until now. Inside were documents, neatly arranged, sealed in plastic sleeves, labeled in my handwriting. I took them out one by one and laid them in a row. There was the deed to the cabin upstate, the one Andrew had always referred to as ours, though he'd never contributed to its upkeep. There were the incorporation papers for the LLC we had created when he launched his first business, and the transfer of ownership documents that, despite his assumptions, had never been filed. There was the joint savings account I had seeded with my retirement payout, the one Andrew believed had been closed years ago. It hadn't. He had trusted me completely, and he should have. I had never given him a reason not to. I had signed checks when his credit was low, offered collateral when banks hesitated, but each time I had done what I was trained to do. I read the fine print, asked for backup documentation, and quietly retained the originals, not out of distrust, out of habit, out of experience, out of the quiet wisdom of a woman who'd spent decades watching the world reward the loud and forget the patient. He had never asked whose name was on the LLC. I had told him we'd file for a change after the first year, once things stabilized. He never followed up. When the business took off, he assumed the paperwork had followed, but it hadn't. The ownership remained where it had started, with me. I sat at the table and read each page again, slowly, carefully, as if I were preparing for an audit. Old instincts returned. The calculator at the edge of the counter, dusty from disuse, found its way into my hands again. I totaled values, rechecked margins, noted dates. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel sad. What I felt was precise. A new kind of balance was due. By noon, I had made the decision. I called my lawyer, an old colleague from my working days, now semi-retired but still sharp as ever. I told him what I wanted to do. He didn't ask why, just told me which documents to bring and gave me an appointment for the next morning. That evening, I gathered the papers into a new folder, a sturdy one. I used dividers and color-coded tabs. I printed a cover sheet. I labeled it Disentanglement. The next morning, I put on a navy blazer and slacks. I wore the flat shoes I used to keep under my desk for late nights at the office. I brushed my hair into a low bun and pinned it with the silver clip Thomas had once given me. I looked in the mirror and saw someone I hadn't seen in a long time. Not just an old woman, a professional, a mother, a strategist. At the lawyer's office, I signed the necessary forms. I transferred ownership of the business into a charitable trust bearing my name. I revoked power of attorney. I updated my will. The cabin would go to a women's shelter, the savings account split between a scholarship fund and a legal aid organization for senior citizens. Everything Andrew thought was his legacy was rerouted, intentionally, legally, and without drama. It took 2 hours. I walked out of the building lighter than I'd felt in years. The air smelled of late spring, fresh mulch, car exhaust, and lilacs from the planter boxes along the sidewalk. I walked slowly, letting it fill my lungs. I didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't revenge. This was correction. That night, I returned home and placed the new documents in the fireproof box. I set the key back on the shelf. I washed the dishes. I folded a load of laundry. I fed the cat that came by my porch, the one I never claimed but always fed. Then I sat on the back steps with a glass of water and watched the sky change. I thought of my son, of the boy he once was, of the man he had become, of how much he had taken for granted, not out of malice, but out of comfort. He had mistaken silence for permission and presence for permanence. But now everything was documented, clear, final. I hadn't raised my voice. I had raised the stakes. 3 days after the party, a courier knocked on Andrew's office door. He signed for the envelope absent-mindedly, expecting contracts or marketing proofs. He probably didn't recognize the return address until he saw the notary's stamp in the upper left corner. By then, the envelope was already in his hands. I imagined the moment he opened it. I imagined the silence that followed. The way his breath might have caught when he saw the name at the top of the letterhead. Mine, written in full, Margaret Elaine Richardson. I imagined him reading each line once quickly, then again more slowly, trying to make sense of the words that were now shaping a very different reality. It was not a letter filled with emotion. I didn't scold him. I didn't cry through paragraphs. I didn't say that I was hurt. I didn't say that I was disappointed. I let the structure of the document speak for itself. The first page was a formal notice of relinquishment. It stated, in clean legal language, that I had chosen to forfeit any future interest in sharing a household with family or receiving familial support. I included the exact date and time he presented the contract for the assisted living facility and noted my understanding that his offer constituted, in effect, a withdrawal of his role as my caregiver. The second page confirmed the restructuring of assets. It stated that I had legally transferred all ownership stakes in Richardson and Grant Development, the LLC under which Andrew operated his construction firm, into a private charitable trust under my name. I noted that the trust was irrevocable. I noted that no transfer of ownership had ever been finalized in his name. I attached a copy of the original articles of incorporation and the annual filings. Each bore my signature, none bore his. I included a paragraph outlining the change of trusteeship for the upstate property, the cabin he and Christina often used as a weekend escape. The deed had been quietly shifted to the Women's Refuge Network, an organization that provided transitional housing for older women displaced by family decisions. They had accepted it gladly. The board would vote next quarter to convert it into a retreat space for survivors. The joint savings account that had once funded his startup had been split, half into the trust, half into a fund I created for elder legal advocacy. There was no ambiguity. Everything was lawful. Everything was final. The third page was personal, just a paragraph, no emotions, only clarity. You made your decision, I wrote. Now I have made mine. I did not ask him to call me. I did not explain further. There was nothing else to say. I imagined the shock, the disbelief, the slow creeping understanding that this wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a reaction. It was a conclusion. I didn't need to hear his voice to know how it would sound. Quiet at first, then defensive, then angry, then confused. And then, if he was honest, afraid. Because for the first time, I had taken away the one thing he never thought I would touch, my silence. He had always assumed my presence was guaranteed, that I would keep giving, keep showing up, keep folding myself into corners to make room for his world. He thought that because I had given him everything once, I would never take anything back. But this wasn't taking. This was drawing a boundary. For years, I had been the quiet support beam in the house he built. invisible but essential, the taxes paid on time, the capital invested without hesitation, the paperwork filed properly, every box checked. I was the structure underneath his success, and he never even glanced at the foundation. Until now. That evening, I sat by my front window, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade behind the trees. The hydrangeas in the front yard had begun to open, their petals tinged with early blue. I made a cup of tea, sat down in my favorite chair, and pulled a throw blanket over my legs. My phone sat face down on the table. I didn't check it. I didn't wait for a message. I didn't expect one, because now he understood. I wasn't moving into a facility. I wasn't stepping away from life. I was reclaiming it. And the papers he had handed me so casually on my birthday were not the beginning of my exit. They were the spark for my return. The days that followed the letter were eerily quiet, as if the world around me was holding its breath. I went about my routine, watering the garden in the morning, walking to the market on Wednesdays, folding laundry while the news murmured in the background. On the surface, everything looked the same, but beneath the stillness, I could feel a shift. It began subtly, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The first ripple came at the grocery store. As I reached for a jar of preserves, I heard two familiar voices near the bakery aisle, neighbors from down the street. They hadn't seen me yet, or perhaps they had and chose not to stop their conversation. One of them lowered her voice, but I still caught the words Margaret, business, and trust fund. When they noticed me turning the corner, they both offered tight smiles and suddenly found the bread display fascinating. The next time I heard whispers, I was sitting in the waiting room at my doctor's office. A man I vaguely recognized as an acquaintance of Andrew's was speaking with the receptionist. He mentioned my last name and said something about things falling apart. He didn't elaborate, but his tone carried that blend of gossip and disbelief reserved for family drama that breaks out unexpectedly. It was never direct. No one confronted me. No one asked questions outright. But the stares lasted a beat too long. The smiles were thinner. Conversation stopped when I walked into a room. I knew the signs. I had worked in offices long enough to recognize the ripple effect of a scandal whispered just loud enough to travel but not loud enough to name. I learned more through absence than presence. Christina stopped posting photos of the cabin. The company's social media went silent for days. A mutual friend who usually sent me holiday newsletters sent nothing at all that week. One woman, an old friend from the PTA days, called to check in and then, with carefully constructed curiosity, asked if I was doing all right with everything that's going on. I told her I was doing fine. Better than fine, actually. She didn't know what to say after that. I knew Andrew was scrambling. He wasn't prepared for disruption. He was used to control, used to predictability, the way I had always stepped back when asked, signed what was needed, showed up when called. He didn't know how to respond when the woman he had quietly set aside stepped forward, not with noise, but with finality. I didn't gloat. That wasn't the point, but I did listen. I paid attention. I could feel the shift in the way the world looked at me. No longer just an aging woman quietly tending her roses, waiting for the occasional Sunday visit. I had become, to them, something else entirely, an anomaly, a story. They whispered about the business. They whispered about the cabin. They whispered about how a woman that age could have pulled something like this off without anyone seeing it coming. I overheard a conversation at the post office. Two men were talking about smart paperwork and how dangerous it is to underestimate old people. They laughed a little, but it wasn't mockery. It was respect with a bitter edge, fear wrapped in admiration. I stood behind them in line, silent, unnoticed, until I stepped up to the window and the clerk called my name. Their laughter stopped. Back home, I opened the window and let in the late spring air. I sat with a book on my lap, though I didn't read. I just listened to the wind brushing through the trees, the occasional car passing, the bird song that filled the spaces between. The house was quiet, but not lonely. It had never felt more like mine. I had never asked for control. I had given Andrew the tools to build a life and never once asked to hold the hammer. But now that I had withdrawn my name from his plans, the structure had shifted, and everyone around him was beginning to realize how much of that foundation had been mine all along. It was fascinating how people could go from seeing you as invisible to seeing you as formidable, simply because you reminded them that you exist on your own terms. They talked about me as if I weren't in the room, as if I had been a myth suddenly proven real, an old woman with a backbone, a mother with memory, a quiet force who had simply said, "No more." They didn't know the details. They didn't need to. The message had already spread. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just changed everything. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock on the door. I had just finished washing the dishes and was drying my hands on a linen towel when it came. A firm, uneven knock that echoed with hesitation. I stood still for a moment, staring at the door as if it might speak before I opened it. The house had been so quiet these past few days that the sound felt intrusive, almost surreal. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, there he stood, my son. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened as if he had rushed or perhaps pulled at it too many times in frustration. There was no briefcase, no smile, no grand explanation, just him. His eyes met mine, then dropped for a second, as if the sight of me triggered something he wasn't ready to face. I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He walked in slowly, like someone stepping into a church, uncertain if they still belonged. I watched him glance around the living room, his eyes landing on familiar objects, photos from his childhood, the knit blanket on the arm of the couch, the stack of old books that always lived near my chair. He didn't say anything at first, and I didn't rush to fill the silence. I had learned the power of space. He sat. I stayed standing. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I remembered, not in pitch, but in weight, stripped of its usual certainty. He told me things had gotten complicated, that he hadn't realized how everything was structured, that he had been under the impression the transfer paperwork had gone through years ago. He used words like misunderstanding and assumption, as if the mess he now found himself in was simply the result of misplaced paperwork rather than misplaced loyalty. He tried to explain his reasoning about the assisted living facility. He said it was meant as a kindness, that he thought it would be easier, that Christina had found the place and he hadn't thought I would mind, that he thought it was time. I said nothing. I watched him fumble through his own discomfort, twisting phrases into softer shapes that didn't quite fit. I let him speak. I let him run out of steam. When he stopped, there was a long silence between us, the kind that stretches, tightens, and threatens to tear if you try to move too quickly. I walked into the kitchen, poured him a glass of water, and set it on the table in front of him. Then I sat down across from him. For the first time in years, I spoke to him without shielding him from the truth. I told him that I had heard every word he hadn't said the night of my birthday, that I had felt every glance, every omission, every decision made without me. I told him I had noticed the shift, the way my presence had slowly become an inconvenience, something to be managed rather than included. I told him I had been generous, not blind, patient, not passive. I reminded him that I had spent a lifetime building something, not just a home, not just a family, but a life of value, of contribution, of thoughtfulness. That just because I had grown quiet didn't mean I had stopped mattering. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, not as his mother, not as the background figure in his story, but as a woman, a full person. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I wasn't there to punish or shame him. I had already taken care of what needed to be done. What I wanted now was only this: my voice back, not the loud voice of confrontation, the steady, clear voice of truth. He listened, really listened. For the first time in longer than I could recall, he didn't interrupt, didn't deflect. His face shifted, softened, sagged, aged. He looked like a boy again, tired and trying to understand a world that no longer bent to his will. We didn't reach a resolution that night. There were no dramatic reconciliations. But when he left, he hugged me, longer than he had in years, with both arms. Later, I stood at the window and watched him walk down the steps and out to the street. He turned once before getting into the car, and I could see he wanted to say something more, but he didn't, and that was fine because I had said what I needed, and it was heard, not reacted to, not corrected, heard. And that was the beginning of something different, something better, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we would rebuild or drift further apart. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My silence had ended, and I had reclaimed the most powerful thing I ever gave away: my word. It was a week after his visit when the envelope arrived. A plain manila envelope, hand-delivered, no postage, no note. I found it resting between the screen door and the frame like something discreetly hidden, as if whoever left it wasn't sure whether to offer it or apologize for it. I brought it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a while before opening it. Inside was a letter, neatly typed, formal in tone. It was from Andrew. He acknowledged what had happened. He didn't use dramatic words or sweeping apologies. Instead, he described what he understood now: that decisions had been made too quickly, too confidently, and without enough regard for my voice. He admitted to assuming too much, to thinking that silence meant agreement, to equating age with compliance. It was a quiet, careful confession, not of guilt, but of realization. And then came the second page. It was a proposal, not a legal document, not a transfer of assets or a formal appeal to regain control of what he had lost. It was something different: a personal agreement, a contract of intention, if not of law. He offered respect in writing. He wrote that he understood he had overstepped, that he had acted out of convenience masked as care, that he wanted to begin again, not with ownership or obligation, but with listening. He asked nothing of me: no reversal, no forgiveness, no restoration of what I had legally removed. He only asked for the chance to rebuild something less transactional, something human. He used words I hadn't heard from him in years: mutual, equity, choice. At the bottom of the page, he had typed a single line: "If you are willing, I'd like to start again, not with expectations, but with truth." I folded the pages slowly, pressing the crease down with my thumb. I thought about how strange it was to see my son speaking to me like a peer, like someone who no longer assumed he knew better simply because he moved faster or earned more. The next morning, I wrote back. No flourishes, no emotion, just clarity. I told him I had no intention of returning the legal control I had restructured. That part of my life had shifted, and I wasn't walking backward. But I said I was open to conversation, to lunch, to something resembling connection, if it came from respect and not duty. I included my own version of a contract. No signatures, no dates, just one sentence. I will meet you where I am respected, not where I am tolerated. I left the envelope out on the porch with his name on it. That afternoon, it was gone. Over the following weeks, small gestures began to arrive in place of grand ones. A handwritten card from my granddaughter, a box of loose-leaf tea I had once mentioned liking, a photo of Andrew's family sent in the mail instead of just posted online. Each was understated but intentional. He called one Sunday just to ask how my garden was doing. He didn't mention money. He didn't ask about the trust. He only asked if I had planted the tulips I ordered last fall. I told him they hadn't bloomed yet, but the leaves were strong. He said that was a good sign. That call lasted less than 10 minutes, but it stayed with me longer than most of our conversations ever had. It wasn't what he had said. It was how he said it. Measured, curious, equal. I wasn't naive. I didn't expect transformation overnight. I knew how deeply habits carve their paths into people, how long it took to unlearn assumptions, especially the ones dressed up as love. But something had shifted. I had drawn a line, not to divide us, but to define where I stood. And to my surprise, instead of retreating, he had taken a step forward, not to reclaim territory, but to stand on shared ground. We didn't need lawyers for that, just honesty, just the kind of contract that isn't written on paper, but in how we show up, in how we speak, in how we finally learn to listen to someone we once thought we already knew. And that kind of agreement, once made, doesn't require signatures. It just requires remembering. The rhythm of my days changed, though not in any dramatic way. There were no sudden shifts, no reinventions, no dramatic revelations, but the space around me began to feel different, more mine, more deliberate, as if I had finally stepped fully into the home I had lived in for decades, no longer as someone waiting to be invited into her own life, but as its sole architect. I still woke early, still opened the same creaky window in the kitchen to let in the morning air. I still watered the garden, still wrote grocery lists on the same notepad with the faded daffodils. But there was a new kind of quiet in my actions, not the quiet of suppression, but of clarity. Every small choice felt like a declaration, however silent. This is mine, this life, these hours, these thoughts. I no longer explained myself. Not when I declined invitations I didn't want. Not when I chose to spend an entire afternoon reading instead of seeing anyone. Not when I repotted my orchids on a Tuesday just because I felt like it. There was a time I would have apologized for taking up space. Now I simply occupied it. I returned to things I had once loved without asking if they were practical. I began painting again, not landscapes or still lifes, but colors and movement and memory. I made messy things that no one else would hang on a wall, but I loved them. They looked like how I felt, unfinished in the best way. I subscribed to a newsletter from a travel company that specialized in small, slow tours through quiet towns. I hadn't booked anything yet, but just the act of looking, of imagining, of remembering that the world hadn't closed its doors to me was enough for now. Sometimes I would sit on the back porch with a cup of mint tea and watch the sun filter through the trees. I would close my eyes and listen to the sound of leaves shifting in the wind and remember the girl I used to be. the one who read too much, who asked too many questions, who dreamed about what life would feel like when she finally got to decide everything for herself. I met her again, slowly, with tenderness. Andrew still called, not often, but steadily, sometimes just to share a photo of the kids, sometimes to ask what I thought about something in the news. He never brought up the business again. He never asked about the trust. It was as if we had quietly agreed to leave that space closed, not out of avoidance, but because what needed to be said had already been said in action. One day, he asked if he and the kids could come by to plant something in the garden. Just a small tree, he said. I said yes, not because I needed the tree, but because I knew what it meant. Not restitution, not penance, just a gesture, a willingness to add something to my world without taking it over. When they came, I watched them from the porch. His daughter with her hands deep in the soil, laughing at how cold it was. His son examining every worm like a scientist, and Andrew digging with more care than I'd seen in him in years. I didn't interfere. I didn't instruct. I just sat with my tea and let the scene unfold. After they left, I walked to where the new tree stood, small, green, upright. I reached out and pressed my palm gently to the trunk. It was still soft, still finding its strength, but it was rooted now, planted with intention, left to grow on its own terms. That's what I had become, a woman rooted, not in obligation or identity handed down by others, but in herself, in the life she had built and rebuilt, in the power she had finally, quietly, reclaimed. My house was smaller than the ones my peers had downsized to. My phone rang less often. My calendar had more blank spaces than appointments, but everything within those spaces was mine. My choice, my rhythm, my time. For so many years, I had followed rules I didn't write. I had swallowed opinions, deferred dreams, made myself smaller so others could feel large. I had been praised for it, called graceful, selfless, dependable, and perhaps I had been. But now I wanted none of those things to define me. Now I was defined by what I said yes to, by what I said no to, by what I no longer explained. I didn't need to reclaim my youth. I didn't want to. I didn't want to go backward. I only wanted this, the present, fully mine. I had earned my life, and for the first time, I was living it on my terms. No signatures required, no permission asked. Just me,